Hi, everyone. So, today we're going to be looking at the politics of the early American Republic. So, we're past the Constitution, we're past sort of the getting rid of the Articles of Confederation and figuring out what is our new country going to be like, and now we're actually putting it into action. So, we'll talk about many different facets, so political parties, major events, and what these early about 15, 20 years look like as we put our brand new government into action. Here we go. All right, so firstly, political parties and major leaders. So, one of the major parties of the time period was the Federalist Party. It's led by Alexander Hamilton. He's the guy with the picture on the top right there. And one of their biggest, most central things that they believed in was that they wanted a strong central government. And that is the government that was created in the new Constitution. In fact, when you look back at even the name of their party, the name of their party comes from some of the words we've learned in the past, like federalism or the Federalists from the Constitutional Convention. They used the same name of the beliefs they had when developing the new Constitution to define their new party. So essentially, this is the party that kind of got their way mostly in the Constitution, and it makes sense that they're the ones that come into power once the new government's around. So they favored rule by the wealthy, the educated elite, and tended to distrust the common man. So the common man back then was most likely a farmer, less likely to be living in the city, but someone that was kind of self-sufficient, but also pretty uneducated. So when we look at the Federalists, they tended to believe that if you had money, if you had an education, you did something right to get to where you are. So they believed they knew better than the common man. They looked at the common person as sort of having the potential for a mob mentality, or trying to basically go into some elements that eventually happen in like the French Revolution, where the people were ruling, but at the same time, there was violence and chaos going on in the republic they created. The people that tended to support the Federalists lived in urban places, so like cities, and in coastal communities that were involved in trade. So these would have been places that had sort of an interest in having good connections with foreign places to make money off the products that we were creating and growing and selling, and getting those to other places that did not have them. So urban means cities, so places that had developed over the previous 100+ years and had kind of these centers of power and centers of money. The party that opposed them called themselves the Democratic Republican Party, and they were led by Thomas Jefferson, so author of the Declaration of Independence, another one of our famous founding fathers. He's the picture in the middle on the right. So coming out of the Constitutional Convention, they supported strong state governments and demanded a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. So they favored something closer to what the Articles of Confederation looked like, but remember, they wanted to change that document to get rid of the problems as to why it wasn't working. But they looked at the new Constitution as potentially problematic because of how it created a strong central government that they had tried to avoid after declaring independence from Britain. All right, so you can see they're a bit of the opposite of the Federalists, where instead of wanting the elite in charge, distrusting the common man, they wanted to find more ways to get the common man involved in political participation. So a lot of that was through voting. So it's through them that at the state level, more people, I should say more property owning white males, eventually became able to vote. And as time goes on, that property holding part will go away. So that in about 30 years from where we are in history here, almost all white males in America could vote, regardless of if they owned land or not. Their big idea was to sort of spread the nation through land ownership. And you can see how that would get support from farmers and people living in the backcountry. So not living on the coast, not living in cities, but that average common man, as I defined earlier, usually a farmer, usually someone self-sufficient. They looked at the Democratic Republican Party as supporting them. So it was back and forth of we support you because you support us. Now, our first president was somewhere in the middle. Hopefully you know his name, George Washington. Now, he did not belong to either party, but he did favor Federalist policies. What he understood, though, from having sort of led the Continental Army during the American Revolution, having a lot of experience in Virginia politics as well, he understood that he needed the ideas of both these parties in order for our new country to be successful. That if he just jumped in and said, all Federalists, no Democratic Republicans, then we might have problems making this new nation be successful. So he included members of both parties in his decision making, so they all felt like they had a say. He did favor Federalist policies, in fact. Alexander Hamilton was kind of like his adopted son in a way, so he listened to Hamilton more than he listened to Jefferson. So he was claiming to be neutral, but he did tend to choose a side there. All right, so let's look at what some of the policies of this early republic looked like. So let's talk about economics first. So what did the Federalists want? They wanted to have an economy based on the new methods of producing, which were manufacturing and industry. So we're talking about factories that were making things that you couldn't just get out of the ground. These are not what we think of in terms of like giant factories today. But more that factories that had to be located near waterways to sort of turn these big wheels that could then power their machines. So we're not talking about steam engines, we're not talking about coal, but the early stages of industrialization, which was already happening in Britain. The Federalists, especially Alexander Hamilton, looked at Britain as a model for how to be a successful economic powerhouse in the world. So he said, if we want to be successful, then we should do what other successful countries have done, which is to industrialize and to move towards more manufacturing of goods. One of the big things they made back then in these factories was a word called textiles, which is just a fancy word for cloth. But because it took so much less time to create cloth with a machine loom rather than doing it by hand, it was a way to make a lot of money and to sort of increase the economic livelihood of the country. Another thing the Federalists wanted to do was to create tariffs. A tariff is a tax on a foreign good. So if we were going to be creating our own textiles, our own goods in our country, we needed to make it less desirable to buy the foreign goods and to buy the domestic made, the locally made goods instead. So by putting a tax on foreign goods, people would then choose to buy the locally made one instead. So protect our industries as we developed them as well. Now, Democratic Republicans did not like this idea. Their idea for the future of our nation was expanding westward into a lot of land that we got from the British when we won our revolution and potentially expanding even more. So they wanted us to become what they called a yeoman republic. And you're like, yo man, what's a yeoman? It's just a small farmer that owns their own land, manages their own business, or self-sustaining, which is what many Americans were at the time. We thought we could expand that way as well. So their idea was that if land ownership were possible for more, Americans would be more equal to each other because all these families had land. If they had land, that was often tied to voting. And so the common man could become more equal to each other as we spread. So those are kind of the differing positions on where we should go as a country. The other major domestic policy had to do with how the nation was going to manage its money, and this had to do with something called the Bank of the United States. So this isn't like a bank where like the average person puts their money, but it's where the government stores all its tax money that it gets and how it sort of decides what to do with that tax money to manage it. It's complicated today. It was complicated back then. If it's a little confusing, that's perfectly okay because it's still a little bit confusing to me. Federalists wanted the federal government to manage both the funds that the federal government brought in and what the states brought in. So they believed that we were a brand new country. There was potential to mismanage the money if every state was doing their own thing. So they said, let the one centralized federal government manage all these funds so we can be sure that we don't have economic problems when we're a brand new country. Their other plan was they wanted to borrow lots of money in order to increase the nation's credit. So in a modern sense, you think of the word credit as like a credit card or a credit score. Credit essentially means, do people trust that you're able to pay back money that you borrow? So if we think of our national debt today, which is gigantic, it got its start all the way back then, but it got its start with a good idea in mind. We were a new nation, and no other nations or institutions could trust us to pay back money we borrowed. But if you borrow money and you show you're able to pay it back, you build your credit. So that's what your credit score means today. You got to take on a little debt in order to improve your credit. And that's what they wanted to do, to prove to the world that we were worthy of their trade and worthy of their trust in finance. Meanwhile, how'd the Democratic Republicans feel? They distrusted centralized government from the very get-go, and so they did not think that the federal government could be trusted to manage things that the states were collecting for themselves, right? They distrusted a centralized government back from Britain. They liked how the Articles of Confederation left many things up to the states, and they felt like this was a power grab by the federal government. Additionally, that was not granted to the federal government in the Constitution. If you remember from your constitutional authority chart, we break things up into delegated powers to the federal government and reserve powers for the states. So they believed that the power to create a national bank was not delegated to the federal government, which is true. So it was up to the states to manage their own bank. Meanwhile, the Federalists would have said, it is necessary and proper, the elastic clause, for us to do this right now. And so if Congress can pass a law, then it's completely constitutional. What eventually happens is these parties make a compromise. Government is the art of compromise. And with people like George Washington there, despite the parties hating each other, compromise was able to get done. So the Federalists get the bank as they want it, but what the South, which is where many Democratic Republicans were from, they get their way because the new capital of our country, Washington, D.C., is put in the South so that it's guaranteed that the North, which is where many Federalists were from, didn't have both control of the financial industry and the political world by having the capital up in their area as well. So again, domestic policy, things specific to what was going on within our country. What we're going to look at next is things that were going on in how we interacted with other countries, foreign nations, so foreign policy. The biggest foreign policy issue of the early republic had to do with the French Revolution, and it created one or more problems for us as a new nation. The essential question was, should a republic, which we were, ally itself with another republic, which France was, or its old ruler, which was a monarchy, which had that king, Britain? There were different political ideas on this. The Federalists said we should make a British alliance. Remember, they even wanted to model our economy on Britain as well. They looked at the French Revolution as chaos, that you had kings losing heads and then leaders of the Republic losing their heads as well, one after another. Lots of room for corruption, lots of room for tyranny, despite it being a republic just like us. France might have been inspired for their revolution by us, but that doesn't mean that they were now our sort of realistic ally for building our influence and building our reputation around the world. Democratic Republicans had more of an idealistic point of view on this. They said we should ally ourselves with France because we are both republics. We have the same values. The French even modeled their Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen on the Declaration of Independence. They helped us win our revolution, so why shouldn't we favor them over the French enemy, the British? I don't know if you remember the French Revolution from world history, but the French Revolution triggered a lot of political turmoil in all of Europe because all these old European monarchies and aristocracies were worried about losing their power in the same way of what happened to the French royalty and the French aristocracy. So we had to choose what to do, and in the end, we chose to favor neither. Remember, George Washington liked to stay in the middle. He liked to listen to both parties. He didn't want to go too far in one direction either way, because what happens if you choose the wrong side? Well, you just made yourself an enemy and you might lose in the process. So he decides it's in our nation's best interest to stay neutral for the time being, to make short-term alliances, but not permanent ones, because that might not be in our new nation's interest a few years down the line, right? A lot of his ideas, again, were inspired by what the Federalist point of view was, especially from Alexander Hamilton, and not as much from Jefferson. As time would go on, Jefferson would feel like Washington didn't value his opinion, so he eventually resigns from advising Washington on his cabinet, eventually runs for president on his own as well. All right, so our last slide going on here is about other significant events of this era. So kind of things that don't necessarily fit in with the other categories, but are still important to know. One thing important to know is throughout this early era, the critical period of the United States, when it was critical to see would our nation work, and the early republic that we're looking at now. There were two very small rebellions against the United States government. One was called Shays' Rebellion, that was before our new Constitution, and one called the Whiskey Rebellion, which happened after our new Constitution. Now, both times, this had to do with, again, that common man, a farmer, rising up against the government, often to do with how the government was taxing them or trying to regulate them too much. Shays' Rebellion resulted in sort of taking over the courts, shutting them down so the government couldn't operate. The Whiskey Rebellion was mad that a tax had been put on whiskey because these farmers were trying to avoid paying taxes on the grain they were growing. So both led to violence in the backcountry. So early on, before the Constitution, Shays' Rebellion was actually a direct cause of the creation of our new Constitution because the leaders saw that they had a rebellion on their hands that they had no power to actually suppress. With the new Constitution, they changed stuff up. And so when this other rebellion happened, the Whiskey Rebellion happened, they were actually able to suppress that rebellion. And it's often viewed that the Whiskey Rebellion and the suppression of it showed that our Constitution was more efficient and effective than the Articles of Confederation because it was easy to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion and very difficult to get rid of Shays' Rebellion. Okay, this is just showing you to keep in mind that just because we had a brand new government and different parties doesn't mean that everybody was happy with it. You can look at politics in any era and find someone's not going to be happy with the government because they're not really getting their way. Just a trend across US history and world history. Another majorly significant event was George Washington retiring from being president. So he had a lot of fears. He knew that he was neutral, that he was trying to do the ethical thing, but he didn't believe that this could happen forever because he could die unexpectedly. And if he died while he was in power, it might lead to a power struggle that would ruin our brand new nation. So he decided, you know what, I'm going to resign sort of elegantly and willingly to show that power needs to go from one generation to the next, that people shouldn't abuse their power, that they do need to move on. Now, he issued this address in order to warn Americans against problems he had noticed in his 8 years of service as president and many years of service in the military and other things before that. So the main warnings were against permanent foreign alliances. We talked about that before. He advised against becoming too allied to political parties or hating the other party. And also advised against abusing one's political power, which he was showing through his sort of very noble step of retiring rather than continuing to hold on to political power as long as he could. And what he did in the process is he set a precedent. A precedent is the idea that you are doing, sort of making a decision that becomes the event that precedes all others. It comes before it, and all future presidents, different words, precedent and president, should follow that same example. And it actually worked until until 1940. We'll talk about that much, much later. All right. The last thing we want to talk about is, in quotes, the, quote, Revolution of 1800. Now, the reason this is important is it's the first time that control of the national government changed from one party to another. It went from being controlled by the Federalists to being controlled by the Democratic Republicans. And the reason that we say it was a revolution is because power changed without a drop of blood. That the Federalists willingly went out of office and the Democratic Republicans came to power. It wasn't like the Federalists tried to have a military coup to keep power or to get rid of the Constitution to keep power. It's that they said, we lost the election, so we need to leave. The new party comes into power and they're in charge, but we can try to run and get elected in the future again. It proved that the US Constitution was valid because it lasted when there was potential for political chaos. Now, just because it lasted doesn't mean there wasn't a little bit of political chaos. political chaos of this revolution was that it was an election, and a very, very nasty election, in which George Washington was not in the picture anymore. And so therefore the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans were at each other's throat, throwing around lies and propaganda to try to get elected by demeaning the other side. It's a little bit of what you have in the picture to the right. It was a Federalist cartoon that was saying that Jefferson was a drunk, that he had the devil on his side, that he was going to try and pull down the entire government. And you can see all that is very much stuff that's attacking him as a person because they didn't like his views. What this shows us is, yes, our Constitution worked, but at the same time, it looks like they weren't going to follow George Washington's advice very well about avoiding the problems of political parties, though they did not abuse their political power, so that was nice. All right, we've reached the end of this, so I hope you guys wrote that all into your note taker within your packet. If you didn't, go back, pause it, rewind to make sure you get all the words in there that you need to get in there so that you've got a good understanding of this content so that we can apply it in class without me just having to talk at you in class. All right, thanks so much for watching, guys. I will see you in class very soon. Bye-bye.